Yeah, there is a sense that I agree with you there, because Blood in My Eye really spoke to me, the revolutionary. This book really spoke to me, the captive.
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Welcome to Left Unread. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
We're simply two sloppulous youngsters seeking any part of the American identity worth reclamation.
There is none.
Wow! What about all the people's struggle? The people's history?
No, you're right.
And this time, we read...
Soledad Brother, The Prison Letters of George Jackson.
Yeah, Blood in My Eye was absolutely fantastic. If you haven't listened to that episode, I highly recommend it. If you haven't read that book, I highly recommend it, even outside of our context. But we read it because we wanted more George L. Jackson. Well, I don't know. How did you like it? What did you think?
I loved it. Spoiler alert. But I think it's such an interesting counterpoint to Blood in My Eye. I've made no secret of the fact that I loved Blood in My Eye, and it really lit a fire in me, spoke to something deeply within me. So I was just hungry for any more George Jackson. And you had said when we were talking about it previously, Blood in My Eye feels more like a manifesto. It certainly feels like a deliberate political program that he's written.
Yeah.
Where this, being his prison letters, is much more personal. And it's quite clear that he's overtaken by his politics all of the time. Like, that's the only lens through which he can view the world. And so it seeps into his personal letters as well. But there's I don't know that softer is the right word, but there's a different side to him present here.
Well, what's interesting is that, maybe this is too broad of a statement, but Blood in My Eye, it's interesting because they're both sets of letters, right? I mean, they're both prison letters in that sense, but these really do feel like personal letters. You know what? Blood in My Eye feels a lot more like theory, and this feels a little bit like praxis, and that's because he's literally applying his thoughts, and you can see his evolution even just in the way that he's talking to his mom and dad, which is, most of the letters in the first half of the book, I should say, are mostly to his mother or father. And you can see him trying to apply what he says is his dialectic to the worldview that his mom and dad have. And, with some success, he's able to change their opinions, but in ways he talks a lot about how that might have even been naive.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about this book is because it's told mostly chronologically. The first chunk is not from his earliest days in prison, but then it kind of jumps back to, I think it starts in 65.
Yeah.
And goes all the way till August 9th, 1970, 2 days, what he says AD, because of the August 7th movement that killed his brother. It's just really interesting to track his progression politically, and I have one thing in particular that I think is especially of note, to see his progression with the politic internally, not just in the way that he's approaching it, like with his parents or talking to Joan or anyone else, but within himself. To see that progression as his theory grows and develops, to see it change his kind of attitudes, his worldview. No,
I totally agree. And I think I know what that one point is probably. Yeah, it's really fantastic to see that kind of, two things I was going to say was interesting is that one, it was published while he was still alive. So,
barely.
Briefly, but that's just interesting in its own right. And the second thing that's interesting is that, he was in prison for 4 years before the start of the first letter in this book. But he says that the first 4 years of letters were all accidentally destroyed because they had nothing but bitterness in them. So, we've already missed a lot of progression, so to speak, in that. But even then, just from, 64 to 70, you can see so much. Like you said earlier, his ideology really seeps into every point of his thinking. He says it himself, that he's retrained himself at that point, that he only has one thing on the mind 24 hours a day. And he doesn't even say what it is because it's pretty clear, Definitely a phenomenal piece. Yeah.
And I guess just one last note about it is, obviously he knows, and he makes comment on regularly, that his correspondence is being closely monitored. The people with whom he is allowed to correspond are being closely monitored and have to go through this whole bureaucratic ridiculousness in order to even correspond with him. So that everything that you're seeing here is filtered through that lens. What we're seeing is, one, the stuff that did get through, and two, the stuff that he knew would make it through.
Yeah. There's some letters, it's unclear whether some of the letters published in here are letters that were returned to him. Because there's times where he'll write one letter that's, quite striking, and then the next letter is like, I just learned that my last letter was returned to me. You never received it. When he's doing this correspondence, he says often, he's like, you have to confirm if you receive these, because we literally just don't know. What's interesting is that I'm curious how much of his writing was maybe returned to him and then maybe lost in a move, or, when he was transferred into close confinement, right? He says that a lot of times his personal belongings are just taken and lost.
He says every time they're gone, yeah.
Yeah, so, there's just a question of how much remains here. Even in the introduction by his nephew, which I genuinely appreciated, he says he has a trove of letters that will never be published. It's curious because when we read Blood in My Eye, I had heard the sentiment that was published against his will. I guess this doesn't really have the same because it was published while he was alive, but it's interesting. I do still have the same question of how the fuck did he get all of those books in jail? How did he keep up with so much? How did he keep up with so much current politics?
Yeah.
He's commenting on, actively going on geopolitical current events,
Yeah, he talks about being happy the day after the Tet Offensive. He's 4 days after Bobby Kennedy is assassinated talking about that.
Right. He talks about Jomo Kenyatta. He talks about Kwame Nkrumah.
Yep.
I mean, these are things that were happening right then and there. It's just amazing, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, you do wonder.
Yeah. Well, I think it's particularly striking because something that George Jackson stresses here is that his kind of ideal world is one in which you have full access to self-determination. It's something that he talks about a couple of times, and there's something so interesting about what potential lies in a person with no self-determination. As you go down the amount of self-determination in your life, there's less and less ability to just take the punishment, and you have to, like he says, I've gained this awareness that I could never turn away from. I could never step away from because I simply know now. And George Jackson is in a position where he has literally no self-determinative capability. Every single action is,
he's in a cell 23 and a half hours a day.
Yeah, exactly. Out of the 10 years he spent in prison, 8 of them were in solitary confinement.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely fucking insane. The fact that that's the thing, is that would drive an average person insane, and he was driven insane in a sense. It's just that he focused all of that insanity, so to speak, into becoming this kind of intense revolutionary. And I mean, we talked about on Blood in My Eye, the kind of revolutionary potential that exists within prisons or within prison reform movements or anything like that. And I just think that George Jackson really exemplifies that kind of thing, that it's like he is somebody who is forced to make the decision to live the fullest because he cannot live the longest, to use his words kind of.
Yeah. He's not interested in living a long life. He's interested in living a full life, a fulfilled life.
Exactly.
Yeah, that question of self-determination, he brings that up frequently. And that was kind of one of my main takeaways from the book. I have a couple of kind of topics where I think that it manifests in one particular kind of mode, but they're all interconnected in this really interesting, complex way. But with regard to that self-determination, I was thinking a lot about the quote-unquote convict mentality. He writes a lot about when you have no ability to self-determine your own life, how that changes your psychosis. I have a couple of things I'll throw out for that, I guess, just to start jumping in. And I would argue that he's suggesting that it starts even before you're in prison. I think he's talking specifically about black men in the mid-20th century and how they're already conditioned to this kind of convict mentality, this attitude, before they're even convicted. It's like a foregone conclusion that they're going to get into crime. He says that very early on page 4. He says, being born a slave in a captive society and never experiencing any objective basis for expectation had the effect of preparing me for the progressively traumatic misfortunes that lead so many black men to the prison gate. There's that inevitability before you're ever in any criminal enterprise. You know what I mean? Before you've even fallen prey to, before you've ever done anything, you're already like, well, I'm going to prison.
Yeah. Even just to jump way ahead on 181, he says it so well here. From the womb to the tomb, this plays in our minds. We are not worth more than the amount of capital we can raise.
Yeah.
And he follows that up by saying, that's why you see blacks pretending to do all right. That's why a black man will buy a new car, a status symbol, before he'll buy food or for his child or clothes for his wife. So much of the mindset that can generate, he says, puts that kind of performative aspect out there. And it's in a way that's, he really says that he's like a total product of his surrounding, He holds so strongly the dialectic materialist point of view. No, I'm being silly there, but he's really conscious of that fact, that we're total products of our surrounding in that sense. The thing is that the surroundings were made, the last 106 years have been so distressing to think about, because all of that surrounding that creates these people as the product of their surroundings was laid by just raw exploitation, right? By just capitalism and profit seeking. And it's very clear to him that it's a horrid beast.
Yeah. So much so that it makes you less human, makes you what he calls the near man or a half man.
Yeah.
You live under this mentality and you're never able to fully realize yourself. He says that too many of us choose to live the crippled existence of the near man, the half man. For that reason.
I love when he mentions, he says that the man who takes parole has surrendered part of his face to save his body.
Yeah.
I mean, so much of that too, he says in his reflections on his father, the way his father's gone through this immense turmoil in his life, and it's like scared him to the point of acceptance, like he's given up so much of his own person just to save his life and to save his family's life and their survival. And I think George Jackson takes that so personally. I mean, not just on a familial level, but he thinks that on a cultural level. He says there's so many times, and this is kind of wrapped up in his own thing, but there's times where he's saying, like, if mothers really want their children to survive, they have to stop saying, be a good boy. They have to stop saying, you got to go along with it just for survival, because in the end, that's really what's killing us.
Yes. So much so that he relates a story of his father celebrating the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. by the FBI.
Yeah.
But that's back to that convict mentality thing. So much of what he writes about his survival in prison is exactly that. You just have to shut up, take your lashings, take your beatings. Yeah. You can't fight back. You can't suggest anything other than what is being told to you by the prison administration, because it's going to bring you trouble. It's going to beat you down. And the only people that ever get out are the people that accept that and use it so they can get out a half-broken person.
What's so damning about that to me is that George Jackson does do that. It's not that he wasn't provocative in jail, of that I am certain, but there's so many times where he's like, I have prevented more riots than any black in the system has ever done, right? I've done more good. Like, I've kept my mouth shut. I haven't provoked anybody, like that. He talks about when different groups of people are sent out into the tiers, like it's almost worse when one black inmate is provocative, because then they have to fight, 3 guys versus 14. And so you can see how he's like really trying to keep within the confines of the system. And the shortest amount of time he could have served was 1 year, right? 1 year to life, indeterminate sentence. And every single time he goes before the parole, even though he's done all of these things that are procedurally like supposed to be beneficial for him, right? He finishes his degree, he finishes high school. The best they can offer is like, 4 or 5 more years and maybe you can go to the prison for honor inmates.
Yeah, it's so heart-wrenching to see in his letters writing about his hearing coming up, and then his next letter afterward is always just like
denied
another year at least.
Yeah, see you in 69, see you in 70. You'll be 40 by the time I'm released.
Yeah.
One thing that he says that's so striking is he says, I'm 26 now and I'll be 26 when I get out, whether that's 40 years from now or not.
Yeah.
And it's like, man, it's really rough.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so much examples of how prisons are so fucking horrid in this book. Like I have a whole section of notes that are just the completely inhumane conditions that they are held in, even outside of the solitary confinement, even outside of just prison as a general idea. They get shit thrown at them. They get called the N-word 100 times a day. They're put into situations where they're murdered. The guards are saying like, oh, kill Jackson and we'll do you some good. They're giving weapons. They're giving guns, not guns. He does mention zip guns, I will say. But they're giving weapons to white inmates and saying, go fucking kill that guy. Like, it's just absolutely insane. And to think that it's really gotten that much better is to fool yourself.
Yeah, that's nonsense to think that it's any different, any better.
Yeah, just really rough.
Yeah. Okay, maybe to kind of shift gears a little bit, but in the same sort of way, I was thinking a little bit about, it's quite clear to me that his mother is a Christian and kind of tries to spout that sort of stuff to him. And he went to Catholic school, sounds like, and he's writing in letters to his father when John is getting put into Catholic school, and he's like obviously very against that. But there's some interesting stuff about Christianity I feel like we should throw out. I'm going to jump to 254.
Okay.
He's relating a couple of stories here. He's talking to Faye
Stender,
yes, a pretty famous prison advocate, worked with Huey P. Newton, ended up working with George Jackson at this time. So he's got letters. It's maybe worth noting that his letters to her are longer, probably because he has some sort of protection where he's able to communicate with her, because prisoners were only allowed to send letters on one sheet.
Yeah.
So all of his personal letters had to fit on a single sheet of paper. So he gets into a little bit more when he's talking to Faye, and later when he's talking to Angela Davis too, which is, side note, again, sorry, it's not clear that she's replying to him very often.
Right. Well, there's one point where he's like, I haven't heard from you in 4 months, in 5 months, It
feels very one-sided.
It's clear they had some kind of correspondence, but he was he, as he said, he really digs righteous people. You
Yeah,
know?
big time.
Yeah, a couple
Yeah.
of times.
Anyways, I'm sorry to get us
go ahead,
off track. On 254, he's relaying a couple of stories about missionaries. He says the black colony lost its conscience to these missionaries. Their schools, their churches, their newspapers, and their periodicals destroyed the black conscience and made it almost impossible for us to determine our own best interest. And a little further down the page, he continues, why are we rushing to board a sinking ship? When we join hands with the established fascist scum in any way, it gives the people of the world, the righteous people of the Congo, Tanzania, Sudan, of Cuba, China, Vietnam, the legitimate right to hate us too. And it got me thinking a lot. I think that this is true of all Christians, but I think that there's something unique to black Christianity that he's speaking of here, because black consciousness is held captive and pacified so much by Christian dogma. Mm-hmm. Belief in a savior, just that alone destroys revolutionary potential. You know, it individualizes failings. It individualizes one's plight. And even shit like the Serenity Prayer, he kind of mentions at one point, I feel like he kind of quotes the Serenity Prayer, and there's such a pacifying force in the face of, like, missionaries are an internalized outgrowth of the colonial mind. Like, there's no exercising missionary work from colonialism.
Yeah.
There's no exercising Christianity from colonialism in Africa.
Yeah.
It's so crazy to see how tangled up the black consciousness is with Christianity and how fucked that would make your brain.
Yeah.
To try to live that dual consciousness, that double consciousness of being a black person and believing in a religion that has decimated your people.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, you know, it's just as he says in here, right? There's no hope without dope, and religion is the opiate of the masses. So, like, it's totally there. Something that just came to me is the fact that, like, the missionary is part of the two uniforms. Just like how he says the two uniforms that control the prison, part of them are violent, they're the guards. Part of them are not violent, the ones that try to control what they eat, try to control what they do, where they go. It's the same thing in colonialism, right? The conquistadors are the violent suit, the violent uniform. The missionary is the non-violent.
Shit. That's good. Yeah, I don't know, man. It's just, we're atheists.
Yeah, we're atheists.
So, I mean,
sorry.
We're coming into it already, I guess, with some predisposition. But
yeah.
Just seeing him respond to his mom and, like, trying to get her to see the contradiction in this ideology and, like, getting mad at her for her appeals for him to seek peace through God or whatever.
I love that he says, like, the same Pope that you say the blessing of is the one that gave his approval to Mussolini for his little adventure in Ethiopia. It's exactly like that. And, you know, I have such a conflicting feeling about religion, man, because
I'm not that conflicted.
I know, and that's the thing is that at its core, I'm not conflicted. The conflict is that I'm not conflicted. There are things in there that just seem unavoidable. That's really the best way I can phrase it. You know, it's not that they're good or bad. It's just that they are simply unavoidable. So I'm really conflicted about that kind of stuff. But George Jackson is 100% correct in all of these things. Is that Christianity, like I said on Caliban, has simply been a tool of the ruling class since its beginning. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm sorry. I'm not sorry.
Yeah, that's just true. That's just an objective fact. And I don't know, man. I was thinking about that related to this convict mentality or this criminality that is imposed subconsciously before you engage in any criminal behavior, you know? Like, it feels like two sides of the same coin to me here, talking about Christianity. And it's just another means of entrapment.
Right. Well, I mean, this is such a Reddit fact, dude, but that's where penitentiary comes from. It comes from the Quakers.
Yeah.
Be penitent. So have some alone time with God, and then you'll come out all right. George Jackson is directly suffering from religious persecution in that sense. He spent so much time in solitary.
Yeah.
You know?
For stealing $70, was it?
Allegedly.
Yeah.
Allegedly. One thing I love, by the way, I know this is off the topic of religion, but one thing I love is when he says, I had $100 and something in my pocket and they took it all.
Yeah.
Clearly that covered the $70 at least. In fact, I think at this point they owe me.
They owe me, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. God. I mean, he does not come off as especially bitter in this book. Like you said, his original letters were discarded because they probably were so bitter or whatever. But he has every fucking right to be.
Right.
It's just, I don't know, man. It's absurd.
He's retrained himself. I mean, not only has he steeled himself, but I really love when he says, as soon as I realized that we were the defeated party in a war, I became relaxed. You know, any stress that I might have had because of my circumstance, any anger, you know, is washed away as soon as you accept that reality, because what he's saying is like, we have made the diagnosis. Now it's time to talk about the cure.
Yeah. He's fully given himself over to the revolutionary life. He wants to fucking be on the road.
Yeah. I love that when he's talking to...
He says he's more Che than Castro.
Right. That's what he's saying when he's talking to... I think it was a woman who he knew before he went to jail, and he's like, the question is really if you're one that's going to hit the road with me.
Yeah.
You know, if you need a permanent bed, or you can wait for the revolution to secure some land. To answer the land control question, I think is what he says. Absolutely so funny. You know, I mean, but there's something to be said about the fact that, like, he's in the perfect position to be a revolutionary because he has everything to give. You know, he has very little to give, ultimately. What's so impressive about George Jackson is that he's still able to make such a revolutionary contribution from his limited point. The fact that he's able to create these revolutionary structures within prison, right? He's able to make connections outside of prison. He's able to drive, I mean, even just the people around him, thinking about his family, from positions where they have pseudo middle class bourgeois attitudes, where they're thinking about God still, to the point where they're talking about pigs, to the point where they're raising revolutionaries, right? He says his mom didn't shed a tear, right? Because she knew that it was the righteous thing, in reference to his brother.
Yeah. You know, knowing about the August 7th movement while reading this, when I saw the date creeping up, I was just like, oh my gosh.
Well, see, I didn't have the context that this had come out before he was killed, and I was really dreading the idea that it was going to come up to, you know, like we were going to see that kind of building in tension up until his death. And you really still can. You know, he talks about how the political climate in America alone is getting worse and worse. We've talked before about how the 70s were such a decade of, like, real terrorism, but, like, you can start to see a lot of that, man. George Jackson talks about the mood on the prison block, and it's clear that he feels in danger.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. He knows his days are limited.
Yeah. It's tough, which is so crazy, too, because he says it right away. Like, right in, like, the 1964, 1965 letters, he says it. So it's like he's had that in the back of his mind this entire time.
Yeah.
You know, and there's really only so much you can do in prison. I love when he says he's been working out in the sun, getting very big and very black.
Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. But the guy was in phenomenal shape. You know, he talks about doing 1,000 fingertip push-ups.
1,000 a day.
Right. Just to quell his sex urge. That's what he says, which... amazing.
I was like, what a routine. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, 23 and a half hours in the cell, man. I mean, he was at the point where he said he was only sleeping 3 or 4 hours, right? He gets fat off of what would starve a man.
Yeah. This is a complete nerd tangent, but if you know anything about the character of Bane from Batman lore, Bane gets all big and juiced up through the use of this drug called Venom, which is all introduced in the story is told in a one-shot called Vengeance of Bane. Okay, Bane was a huge hit, so they came up with a Vengeance of Bane 2, came out not long after, and the story is that he has gotten clean from Venom, and in his getting clean, he's gotten kind of fat and like lethargic and all this other sort of stuff. I think he gets framed for a crime. He gets put in prison. He gets beat up in prison, and he ends up killing a guy while he's fighting the guys in prison, so he gets put in solitary for like 8 months or something like that. And it's like there's a page turn reveal where he's coming out of the cell and he comes out all fucking jacked.
Man.
Anyway,
if you've got all that time to work out, man.
The third kind of mode that I was thinking about while reading this that he talks a lot about is education.
Yeah.
And, you know, we are kind of close to that, but there are a couple of quotes I wanted to pull out just to string something together here. Very early on page 7, he writes, "I know now that the most damaging thing a people in a colonial situation can do is to allow their children to attend any educational facility organized by the dominant enemy culture." And when I read that before, you know, this was 7 pages in, so I wasn't that deep into it. But when I read that, I wrote, this is why I left education. Like, I felt very uncomfortable being a cog in that machine, a part of that machine that kind of grinds up kids and indoctrinates them in a way that I think is not healthy, obviously. But there are a handful of other quotes that I want to throw out related to this as well. If I can jump to 42.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's talking to his dad, talking about his mother, about how she failed him so bitterly in matters of the mind and spirit. And he writes, "My education she put in the hands of the arch foes of my kind. This is a betrayal of the worst kind. Because of this, I've had to learn everything I know now on my own by trial and error. I have almost arrived, but look at the cost. I would not be in prison now if she hadn't been reading life through those rose-colored glasses of hers, or if you would have had time and the wisdom to tell me of my enemies and how to get the things I needed without falling into their traps. And this is just another one of those like modes of entrapment, of encirclement that I was talking about. The trap of putting education in the hands of the ruling class catches everyone that gets put through it. To some degree, at the very least, you are losing time. Everyone that finds their way on a revolutionary path has to undo the work of that education. Liberation can never be known that way. And I went into education, very blind to that, with an idea. I had a poster in my room my first year that said, "Reading arms you against oppression," trying to communicate to my students that the only way to fight systems of oppression like this are to understand them, know what's going on in the world, and respond in kind. But that's a fucking foolhardy, naive idea. I spent 10 years in the classroom trying to do that. And I don't know, reading George Jackson say this put words to that feeling that made me step out of the classroom, and also just really fucking hurt. I don't know.
Yeah. Just a quote that I think kind of sums it up a lot. On 113, he says, he's talking to his dad here, and he says, "If my instructor tells me that the world and its affairs are run as well as they possibly can be, that I am governed by wise and judicious men, that I am free and should be happy, and if I leave the instructor's presence and encounter the exact opposite, if I actually sense or see confusion, war, inflation, recession, depression, death, and decay, is it not reasonable that I should become perplexed?"
Yeah.
That's the problem with being inside of that system, is that you have to do it with a smile, like that. I've said this before, I'm sure, but that was my biggest issue, is that we were in the nicest version of the machine that grinds up children, it was still grinding up kids. And that really sucks, and there's just simply things that were out of my power to deal with. And the problem is that especially because I taught math, man, how can I teach a kid that this shit is important when, they don't have dinner to go home to? You know what I mean? Solve for X, but it's what are you going to eat?
Yeah, and I mean, probably everyone listening to this knows the way the public education system was developed in the United States, so we don't need to get into that, but it was very deliberately designed to create an obedient, quiet, particular type of worker. Even the best intentioned classroom is still participating in that kind of invisible curriculum of submission, subservience, of unquestioning devotion. It sucks. And he articulated it in a way that really spoke to me. I kept seeing the connections kind of every time he would talk about Christianity. I'm connecting it to criminality and education. Every time he talks about one, I'm thinking about the other two, because it feels very much like this this triumvirate that is all working to communicate the same idea. You are trapped. This is your fate. Shut up and suck it up.
Right. Two things. I do want to read this quote on 255 because I just think it's so funny. He says, "It's clear that no school would be better. Burn it. All the fascist literature, burn that too. Then equip yourself with the little red book. Yeah. We must destroy Johnson Publication and their little black tabloids that mimic the fascist press." I love that he says Mao-think, by the way. Mao-think is very funny to me. It's clear that he loves Mao. How can he? I mean, in the 60s, 68, I could definitely see why. Still have 8 glorious years. Sorry, I just had the thought that he would be shattered. He would be shattered at modern day. Do you think he would be a Dangist? I think the answer is certainly not.
I don't think so. No.
No need to deal with that. Well, I mean, according to him, even MLK was a Maoist, which is very funny. And I agree.
I mean, everyone's seen the letters that he's written to Coretta about how socialism is clearly the superior political method.
I know that George Jackson was not having a laugh here, but we just need a more ridiculously radical, MLK was a Gonzaloist. MLK was a fucking Posadist. Anyway, there's something that's so interesting that you said there, and it's about that, suck it up. This is what you've got. This is what you have to work with. And it's the fact that even working with that isn't good enough. On 118, George Jackson says something that's so fantastic, right? Two things, really. One of these quotes is so incredible. It starts on the page before. He says, "Chew on this a few moments. A colonizer, a usurer, the original thief, a murderer for personal gain, a kidnapper-slaver, a maker of cannon, bombs, and poison gas, an egocentric parasite, the original forked tongue, the odd man is trying to convey to us that we must adjust ourselves to his warp, that we must learn to be more like him, that because we're not, we're backwards, underdeveloped, unsophisticated. This is strange and contradictory. To all appearances, they are upset with me for doing these things. That privilege is supposed to be reserved for them, I guess. So what do they mean by saying we must get in with them, be like them, adopt capitalism, clothe ourselves in Western ways? This is a strange and contradictory thing. If we, the colored and black of the world, adopt capitalism, where would we have to seek our colonies? Europe? The U.S.? Who would we capitalize on if we use their history as a pattern?
Yeah.
Right? So it's like we're shown these trappings of life and saying, this is what you have to work with. This is the society we live in. This is natural, economic order or whatever. But like, if we were to even follow those methods, what would we do? Who would we capitalize on? Right? And I know that when I say we here, when George Jackson says we, he's not talking about me and you.
Yeah.
Right? But the point still stands. If society wants us to live capitalistically, then it requires exploitation on someone. You are damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Yeah, there must always be a subordinate class. And he says on that page, I think what they mean is not do as I do, but do as I say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Gosh. I mean, I think that there's just really something to be said about George Jackson's person. I love the way that he writes. I did really appreciate seeing his personal perspective here. Even though he is so strong in this is not like a huge topic or anything, but I just love that he mentions that he has his own little escapist fantasies anyway. Like he dreams about a villa in the Maldives, right? He says like, it's at the point where I would be satisfied with just having a boat and fucking off.
Yeah.
If I could go fish in the waters, I would just do that. Right? I mean, he talks about like, I'd move to Tanzania, stuff like that. Like, even someone like George Jackson is not free from the kind of depressive struggles of being a revolutionary.
Of having your eyes even halfway open in this fucking world.
Yeah, exactly, man.
This is kind of related. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to bring up as a topic was just kind of revolutionary potential.
Yeah.
He does speak a little bit about the revolutionary potential of the United States, but what really struck me is coming at this from the perspective of 2026, knowing that he is writing at the tail end of the 60s, right at the start of 1970, maybe the most radically optimistic time in U.S. history. He's writing from a vantage point of knowing that there is a vanguard party in the United States that is mobilizing, obviously the Black Panther Party.
Yep.
And though he is seeing the repression of that party, and maybe that's part of it, it's baffling to me in hindsight to see someone in the middle of maybe the most revolutionary potential the U.S. has ever had speak as though there is not enough revolutionary potential. The quote that really jumped out to me, I mean, it's not really a quote, it's kind of the whole letter on 277, but he says, "This is for certain, it's going to get worse. Things will become much more difficult before anything good can come of this. People like Nixon and the ventriloquists that make him speak hold forth by default. The good element has not contested them vigorously. For the very same natural reason that allows flotsam to rise to the surface, these people have come by the means and power to cause great discord and suffering. They met little resistance on their way up. Good people don't like to cut throats. This unnatural arrangement that allows the sediment to remain on the top while the cream rests on the bottom can be righted in only one way. The VC have the idea. They understand a trial of combat, an ordeal by fire. You simply can't reason with people like them. They have too much to lose by being reasonable." And again, it's just crazy in 2026 to see Jackson lament the lack of revolutionary action, revolutionary leadership, revolutionary education in his time, which was probably the most potential the U.S. has ever had. Now, he's right, I think, to look at Vietnam and see that as a model for true revolutionary potential. But
yeah, I was going to say that there's something of like a disconnect in this book in a couple of places. I mean, that's one of them. I love when he says, on 226, a little bit earlier, "The righteous people of the world who are struggling with the monster on the only terms that he can be fought must have many reservations concerning us, especially those of us who are black. What are the fierce and wonderful people of Vietnam thinking of us? Where is the real left wing? What has been done to us that makes us fail to resist?" The disconnect is there because at the same time, he's saying he has so much hope for the potential within America. On 29, he says beautifully, "Do you know where the barbarians and guerrillas are going to come from that destroy Imperial America? From the black colonies and these concentration camps."
Yeah.
Right? He says that the American revolutionary are the only people that can face this beast without subjecting the world to nuclear destruction, right? Because they're striking from within. Anywhere else is still under the threat of U.S. nukes, but he says that that same threat doesn't really exist from within the U.S., and that's an interesting question, especially in 2026 to think about, right?
Thinking about that in the context of right now.
Yeah, God. But it's that thing that we've talked about before, right? Like, you cut the fucking head off the snake and the body dies, right? The U.S. is such it's a hegemon. It's a hegemon. So there's a disconnect there, and it's just tough to deal with. Much in the same way that he talks about the potential of prisons as a whole. Like, he's talking about how these concentration camps are going to be at the center of it. And then, at the same time, he's saying, like, I'm locked up with a bunch of 20-year-old cretins. I don't know.
Well, it's that disconnect with, I was reading that through the lens of his critiques of education also, because it is quite clear that, like, he sees a true lumpen proletariat potential in prisons. He even says, like, we attempted to transform the black criminal mentality into a revolutionary mentality. But then at the same time, he's greeted by behavior in prison of folks that he characterizes as completely oblivious to everything that's happening around them, so devoid of class consciousness that they're more interested in being pimps and selling dope.
Right.
And that to me, I don't know. I know I started this by saying there was a connection to education. That to me is connected to that same sort of thing, that so buying into that convict mentality, that criminal conditioning, that they don't seek education beyond, or not allowed any means to thrive outside of criminality. And so, like, just kind of take the ball and run with it. And he's like, what the fuck am I supposed to do with that?
Yeah. Okay, no, I think that's fair.
But it's tough. Because that's for real, dude.
That's the same kind of struggle that we've talked about with the majority of America being who they are, being median voters, right? It's like, how do you seize the revolutionary potential within that, right? How do you reclaim that? How do you re-educate that?
Off to the gulag.
No, maybe. I don't know. I'm gulag neutral.
Gulag neutral. There are little narratives throughout that you trace through the letters that tell these little stories also, that, not little in a condescending way, but you know what I mean.
Just like little self-contained things.
Yeah, like his request for a typewriter. He gets the typewriter is broken. He has to send it for repair.
Yeah, and he says,
never get a plastic typewriter.
Yeah, yeah. Well, even at the same time, in line with this fucking cruel treatment, there's one letter where he says, thanks for mentioning my leg to somebody, because they never would believe me. He had a leg injury, and it would have gone untreated if it weren't for his father saying something. In the same vein, though, his father reports unquotes him and says that it will be he's like a threat to himself, and it gets him in a lot of fucking trouble.
Yeah, there's a time where he cuts off communication with his parents.
Dude. He says, to hell with it all. Yeah. Blood is not thicker than water. I've had enough of your bourgeois ideology, mom and dad. You're cut off. Don't ever write to me again. 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
It's a good book, y'all. It's a good book.
It's heart-wrenching in many ways.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, let's hit it. What's your last topic, Aaron? I'm so curious.
Let's talk a little bit about misogyny. There's something kind of interesting that I was tracking here that led me on a whole journey. But first, let's just point out that pretty early on, you start to get a couple of hints of maybe some misogynistic attitudes that George is harboring.
Yeah.
They come out lightly at first. I'll give you an example of the first one that kind of raised my eyebrow. The cruelest and most suppressive treatment has always fallen on to the males because they have not that tender defense the woman is born with. And my comment to myself was, woman was born with. There's a trained feminist would note some biological essentialism in that. Then we get the quote on 48. When the women outnumber the men in the black societies, the men take as many wives as they can afford and care for them all equally. In the white, for some nebulous reason, the men can take only one. The rest are left to become prostitutes, nuns, or lesbians. Okay? Their job is to train the children in their early life to be men or women, not confuse psychotics. Okay, so some misogyny is showing there. Yeah. Shows up again on 91. He's talking to his mother. That which you didn't do, I never expected, for you are, after all, a woman, and think as a woman should. Okay. 108 is the big one. I was like, okay, it's official. Don't wait for me to change or modify my attitudes in the least. I cannot understand as you put it, or as you would have me understand. I am a man, you are a woman. Being a woman, you may expect to be and enjoy being tyrannized. I'm like, okay, come on.
Right.
There are a couple more.
Yeah.
I'll skip all. I don't have to read every single one, okay? But by the time we get to 125...
Yeah, 125.
I was fed up
Yeah.
with it. Women like to be dominated, love being strong-armed, need an overseer to supplement their weakness. For this reason, we should never allow women to express any opinions on the subject, but just to sit, listen to us, and attempt to understand. It is for them to obey and aid us, not to attempt to think.
Yeah.
And I was like, what the fuck, George? My vision of you is becoming a little shattered here.
That's why I think, just like you said in the beginning, man, I think that this book is such a great counterpoint to Blood in My Eye, because it shows that George Jackson is a person. That's not to wave away his misogyny. It's just the fact that, like, yeah, he was 18 when he went to jail, and then he spent 10 years in prison, you know, in sex-segregated prison. He's dealing with his own urges as well, and I can only ascertain from a lot of this letters that mama is at the root of the issue. You know what I mean? Like, he's struggling with mother issues. And again, I'm not hand-waving George Jackson's misogyny here, especially because, as I'm sure we'll see, you know, it does lighten a little bit. But the thing is that, like, he's a kid.
Yes, this is 1967.
Yeah.
And, you know, there was a point even a few pages later where I wrote, like, we're all imperfect, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting, too, because I'm looking back on 85. He's writing to his mother, and he says, the black woman has in the past few hundred years been the only force holding us together and holding us up, right? She's absorbed the biggest part of many shocks and strains of existence under a slave order. The men can think of nothing more effective than pimping, gambling, or petty theft. Right? So he still does have some appreciation for women, especially black women. Inside of him, I think that his view is just completely warped by his own situation and also maybe some mommy issues.
Yeah, well, you are correct that it seems to get better as his education furthers, / truly it seems to develop when he develops a relationship with Angela Davis.
Yeah. Yeah, when he's talking to other actual women besides his mother.
Yeah, there's the woman that you mentioned previously. Her name is Joan.
Oh, okay, yeah.
If I'm remembering right.
There's like a few women that he starts talking to at the end. What we were laughing about earlier is that he may or may not be flirting with all of them.
All of them at once.
Yeah, every single one.
Yeah, but it becomes clear. I'll jump to 298 then, which is May of 1970. So 3 years have passed here. He's writing letters to Angela Davis. There's clearly been some correspondence and some communication, though it is more on the side of George than Angela, it would appear. But it's quite clear that he has a high opinion of Angela Davis. He says, I never thought this kind of environment could produce one like her, but at the same time, I knew that things could never be good with me without her. And he says later, farther down that page, I understand exactly what the woman's role should be. The very same as the man's. Intellectually, there is very little difference between male and female. The differences we see in bourgeois society are all conditioned and artificial. So there is clearly a feminist development in his thinking here. And again, he was a young man, not that young, not that that is an excuse, but like, I was glad to see that development.
Yeah.
But it also got me thinking about these fucking blind spots that we have and how easy it is to recognize subjugation, recognize power imbalance, recognize, forces of oppression in so many ways and miss it in some of the most obvious ones. Like that note that I wrote to myself that I mentioned before, it was next to this quote from 1967, where he writes, "It is terrible that we have all been so divided. The social order is set up so as to encourage this. The powers that be don't want any loyal, loving groups forming up, so they discourage it in 1,000 subtle ways. And as it is said, when poverty comes in the door, love leaves by the window." Yeah. This is a paragraph after one of the most misogynistic things that he had said. The irony that we're all imperfect and unable to see that. I mean, obviously there are many facets where this plays out, where we have these blind spots. I don't know. I don't have a comment other than to say that's fucking stupid.
I have some thoughts that I'm stringing together here, and what I was searching for during this time was that I think that he was influenced not only with his communication with actual real life women besides his mother, but he also mentions that he was influenced by the Cuban program, their family program, where he says that men and women share the same role, children have a role, that kind of thing. And part of me is just thinking that it's the lived experience that does the thing. Something that George Jackson says here is that he's becoming convinced that black people can never fully be convinced by ideology, that they have to be dealt with in some material circumstance. I mean, there he's saying that like money is always at the end of it because that's what our society is built on. But I think this is an example of him demonstrating that experience is what changed it, right? Much in the same way, he's converting his father. Just the exposure to George Jackson's dialectic doesn't do it. What he says might have been the catalyst was a guard saying something nasty to his sister. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's like the experience is what ultimately changes those things, because like you said, it is a total blind spot. I'm just curious what kind of blind spots we might have now,
I'm certain there are some. I mean,
don't give me that look.
No offense. I very obviously think animal liberation is one that a lot of people on the left miss. I think there's weird shit with Palestine and Ukraine that people that claim to be leftists will spout. And now with Iran, that's obviously coming up as well. So there are going to be specific situations like that, situational ones like that.
Two big ones in my mind are disability always, and then children.
Ageism, children being maybe the most oppressed class, the most human animal oppressed class.
That's an interesting conversation that I have no knowledge about,
Yeah.
So I don't even know where to begin. But it's just like those blind spots do exist.
Yeah, like your point about his father, like the dialectic not getting through to him, but a guard saying something nasty to his George's sister. Mm-hmm. No offense, that's fucking stupid. That's the I have a daughter attitude.
It's in the same way that it's in the same way though that George Jackson went through his pre-jail life blind. Like he said, he's awake now, but at what cost? Mm-hmm. It's not to say that is the cost that has to be extracted here, to really agonize my own metaphor, but it's that's the cost that it took. It could have cost less, but that's what happened. I mean, I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. It's just the truth of it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It just is.
Yeah.
And, I'm probably coming off as kind of holier than thou in this in a way that I'm not super comfortable with, because obviously I am an imperfect person and haven't had the perfect political line on things for forever, nor do I now. But even just in my lifetime, in my adolescence, the attitude toward homosexuality versus now has shifted so much that I wasn't as sensitive to it back then, nor as able to accept my own sexuality, my own queerness as I am now.
Who are you talking to, man? I've expressed before that had other circumstances happen, I'd probably be a fucking Republican right now.
There is a part of that it's just the reality. You are in the material world. You are socialized in the situation that you're socialized in. You know what I mean? You don't have control over being born, where you are being born, how you are being born, under the conditions. And so a certain part of it, you have to grow through. You still have to wade the waters of it to find the way. I don't know.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, you also just have to kind of keep that hope too, just to kind of talk about that optimism. I love when he says on 327, he signs off, this is in a letter to Joan, we will win, and there's a footnote, and it says, anyone who doesn't sense this fundamental power of the people cannot be a guerrilla fighter, and it's you just have to hold that kind of optimism to it, that you can, in fact, wade through it, and on the other end, there's maybe some land.
Yeah. I guess I'm just especially sensitive to misogyny because so much of the history of the Black Panther Party in particular, and figures like Eldridge Cleaver, are so steeped in a misogynistic attitude that I'm hypersensitive to it, and it's just it's so obvious from the outside, I guess, to see that contradiction. This
is not to put you down, because I think that we're just operating with a lot of hindsight here, because those points have been points of schism, even thinking back to when we read Angela Davis, Women, Race, and Class, the feminist movement was used essentially, or it was a point at which divisions were created in the abolitionist movement. You know what I mean? And it's that same kind of thing where we're looking out for those blind spots because they can be used so severely against us. It's that same kind of thing. Just another round of self-criticism, and soon we'll have the perfect line.
Yeah, fair enough. So yeah, let's jump into the cavalcade.
There's one I have to start on 24. This is early on. But he's just talking about the kind of person that becomes a pig, so to speak. And he's talking about the prison police. And he just asks, Faye, have you ever considered what type of man is capable of handling absolute power? I mean, how many would not abuse it? Is there any way of isolating or classifying generally who can be trusted with a gun and absolute discretion as to who he will kill? I've already mentioned that most of them are KKK types. The rest, all the rest in general, are so stupid they shouldn't be allowed to run their own bath.
Yeah.
A responsible state government would have found a means of weeding out most of the savage types that are drawn to gunslinger jobs long ago. How did all these pigs get through? They get through because that's the point.
Yep. It's not a bug. It's a feature.
Yeah.
On 29, I was kind of gut struck with this one. I could reach to explain to him that there were no good pigs, but the task was too big. I was fighting his mind first and his fear of admitting the existence of an identifiable enemy element that was oppressing us, because that would either commit him to attack that enemy or force him to admit his cowardice. Hit me like a fucking brick, man.
Yeah. So much of his conversation with his parents really struck me. I mean, that's such a huge part of this book. Just to follow that one up, I love on 203. It's kind of out of context here, but he says, just don't mistake any of the lies for the truth. Robert will lie to you if he thinks it will help you to survive. He has been surviving on one for half a century.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, it takes a lot to come out from behind that mask, you know?
Yeah, I was thinking of Fanon quite a lot, actually. I have a couple of notes here where I just wrote Fanon in the...
He there's a part where he's talking to John, and he says, call your sister and read Mao and Fanon, which I thought was really fun. A couple of weird topical things in here that remind me that this was not that long ago. Like, at one point he mentions Bill Cosby.
Yeah.
You know?
Because I Spy, yeah.
Yeah. Very, just really jarring. Yeah, it's like learning that MLK and Anne Frank were born the same year.
Yeah.
You know?
Oof.
Sorry.
Yeah. I have one on 39, just kind of a lighthearted one. We have birthdays this week, though I have lost all my sentimentality. I know you people still cling to the old, so I'll observe the social amenities by wishing you health on your birthday.
Yeah.
I feel so seen. I fucking don't give two shits about a birthday. I don't know.
Dude,
that's great.
There's so many times. Well, two things. First off, I love that he says, like, these fucking Europeans have reduced life down to formula with their little phrases. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But there's times in this book where I have to remind myself that he was, like, in his 20s. You know, like, he died in 28. Like, oh, God, talk about a gut punch. There's a point where he says that his hair is graying.
Yeah.
And he was 24 when he wrote that, dude. Like, that's really rough.
It's a stressful life he was forced to live.
Yeah.
I have another one on 87, just below that Pope line you mentioned before. And I just wrote 2026 in a nutshell. If children being blown out of this existence while attending church services, men being lynched for a gesture, colonialism, the Inquisition, and H-bombs haven't affected you, nothing I say here can help you.
A great one on 117. Again, he's talking to his father. And he says, capitalism, I believe, the capitalizing on the next man's labor, on the next man's weakness, has contributed greatly to the development of the anomalous Western man. Capitalism, competitive enterprise, man competing against man for the necessary things, for status symbols, for power to repress his competitors and secure his personal well-being, to exercise his ego is fancy. That was a horrible sentence. I cannot just get used to the idea of some petty, stereotyped, bureaucratic official patently suffering from some mental disorder asking me questions, calling on me to explain myself. Just kind of back to that, how much self-determination does life really allow?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, he even kind of gives a slavery by another name kind of argument elsewhere in the book.
I really appreciate it because I've been saying it for a long time. You know, I mean, he literally calls it neo-slavery.
Yeah.
Just slavery changed forms when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. That's what he says.
Yep.
Fantastic.
I would go back a few pages to 111. He's talking to his mom here, trying very hard to get through to her, saying, I suggest no action, no physical action, that is, but I do suggest that you purge your mind little by little of some of your Western notions. And he gives us this analogy. If you were right now walking toward your kitchen with the whole family's life savings in your hand, let's say, and I sneaked up behind you and pulled the rug from under you and you fell and broke your arm, leg, nose, and the money flew into the burning fireplace, would you get up blaming me for pulling the rug? Or would you just lay there and blame yourself and pretend that you didn't really fall? Or that the whole thing made no difference anyway? Then he congratulates himself. The analogy is perfect.
Even just thinking about, this is actually on 127, I love the way he says this.
I didn't create this impasse.
Yeah, exactly. The author of my hunger, the architect of the circumstantial pressures which are the sole cause of my ills, will find no peace in this existence or the next, or the one following that. Never, never. I'll dog his trail to infinity. Yeah, and then below that, I mean, this whole page is amazing.
Yeah.
But I didn't create this impasse. I had nothing to do with the arrival of matters at this destructive end, as you infer. Did I colonize, kidnap, make war on myself, destroy my own institutions, enslave myself, use myself, and neglect myself, steal my identity, and then, being reduced to nothing, invent a competitive economy, knowing that I cannot compete? Sounds very foolish, but this is what you propose when you place the blame on me or on us.
Yep.
It was a fool who created this monster. I am his victim. Incredible.
Here's another funny, just silly one. But back on 115, Penny, his sister, brought her daughter to visit George and taught the little guy how to say Uncle George. I tried to get him to change it to Comrade George.
Yeah.
He didn't seem to understand. That's just funny to me.
It's good stuff.
Oh, I have the different kind of slavery quote where he throws that out.
Yeah.
This is on 174. Regarding this domestic issue, I must be the first to admit that I see that the black family unit is in ruins. It is our first and basic weakness. This fact may contribute much to our difficulty in uniting as a people, but for every effect, there is a cause. There are 3 historical factors that have produced the present state of chaos on the family level of our black society. 1, first, the family unit was destroyed during chattel slavery. Second, our cultural institutions and customs upon which unity depends and without which cohesiveness can never exist were destroyed and never replaced. Third, our change in status from an article of movable property to untrained misfits on the labor market was not, as most think, a change to freedom from slavery, but merely to a different kind of slavery.
Yeah. If you cannot visit Zanzibar, Havana, Peking, or even Paris when you get the urge, you are a slave.
Yep.
Yeah. I really love, this is on 253, but he says, the pig is an instrument of neo-slavery to be hidden and avoided. Recall they never found the TV set you lost in that burglary. And then he says, the pig is merely the gun, the tool, a mentally inanimate utensil. It is necessary to destroy the gun, but destroying the gun and sparing the hand that holds it will forever relegate us to defensive action. Hold our revolution in the doldrums, ultimately defeat us. Later on he says, spare the hand that holds the gun and it will simply fashion another.
Yep. I have this line that I liked a lot.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking to John, his brother, who's getting into some trouble at school with other people. When a sucker gets so foolish as to warn you in advance that he's going to kill you, the next sound he utters should come through swollen lips. I fucking love that. You know, we were talking about his kind of acceptance that he was a dead man very early on, and he says on 234, I might be the most resilient dead man in the universe.
Yeah.
That just really struck me.
Yeah. There are a couple of times where he says that, we mentioned this in the Blood My Eye episode, but we haven't really talked about it here, but like, he is still such an internationalist. Like, that is something that's totally impressive to me. He says, like, we need allies, straight up. That all is really interesting. There's a couple of times where he's like very explicit, like, I don't hate white people, you know? Like, I love on 289, he says, if all whites were my enemies, would it make sense for me to fight them all at the same time? It just absolutely cracks me up.
Yeah, he says the theory that all whites are the immediate enemy and all blacks are brothers, making them loyal, is silly and indicative of a lazy mind. To be generous, since it could be a fascist plot. He's keen to pick that up. On the last episode, the Democracy for the Few episode, we got to talking a little bit about globalism, and I was talking a little bit about trade and how I don't think an international trade market is necessary,
right,
so to speak. He says on 261... he's talking back to an instructor in like a civics type course that he was taking. And he said he held his tongue as long as he could. And then finally on like this day, he couldn't
help himself.
He stood up and was talking back to this guy. And he said, they're talking about China. You did say they bought it. It means that they must be doing pretty well. The principle of economic advantage means that the people in their respective areas, nations if you prefer, with their respective differences in climate and topography should produce the thing which is easy and natural for them to produce. With proper organization, they will be able to produce a surplus of this thing, and they produce well. And this is a better encapsulation of the thought that I had about international trade. Like, there are things that particular regions produce that other regions can't.
Sure.
The point is that those regions obviously shouldn't be exploited and under the thumb of the hegemonic imperialist powers so they can have all of it. We want all of that coltan and cobalt and all that. And, you know, fucking 200 people will die in a mine collapse in Congo and no one will give a shit.
Well, it's so funny that he even mentions on that same page, you know, Canada buys beef from Argentina. Does that mean Canada's about to collapse economically?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Was that peaches grown in Brazil, packaged in Thailand, sold in the U.S.? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
There is something that he says, two things that are funny. I love that he asks the question, would Nixon really accept a people's government? But his critique of the government that I appreciate is actually on 169, because he says very simply, re-examine this point. If a government truly reflected the wishes of the people, if it truly represented a fair cross-section of the populace, it would follow that if the means of production and distribution were placed in the hands of the government, they would be controlled by the people. The central point is that the government must be truly representative. And then he says also nationalization is the only answer to the problem.
Yeah.
Very good.
Take care of yourself.
Yeah. Take care.
I guess the last one I would throw out is on 266.
Okay.
He writes, I don't want to die and leave a few sad songs and a hump in the ground as my only monument. I want to leave a world that is liberated from trash, pollution, racism, poverty nation-state wars and armies, from pomp, bigotry, parochialism, 1,000 different brands of untruth, and licentious, usurious economics. Me too, George.
Yeah.
Me too.
All right. So that was it. Soledad Brother.
Yeah.
You should read this book if you've read Blood in My Eye. You should read this book even if you haven't.
Yeah, my answer is very much you should read this book if you haven't. You should read this book if you're waiting on Blood in My Eye to arrive in the mail, because you should read that one too.
That's an interesting question. It's not a question that I was left with this book, but I'm curious to get your take, because Chris asked me this, but which one do you think is worth reading first?
That is an interesting question. I got maybe 40 pages into this, and I was like, I'm not sure that this is the one for me.
Yeah.
Blood in My Eye spoke to me so deeply.
Right away, too. It's like...
Yeah. And it's because it immediately started addressing the uncomfortable questions that sit in my gut every day,
Yeah.
This one, the deeper I got into it, the more I felt I understood and to a degree could see myself in George Jackson.
Sure.
And so there was something, it was a different kind of itch. It satisfies something very different.
Yeah. There is a sense that I agree with you there, because Blood in My Eye really spoke to me, the revolutionary. This book really spoke to me, the captive,
That's a great way to put it. And I think the answer to the actual question, which should you read first, probably depends on your political development.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Because I think for you and me, I think that reading Blood in My Eye was definitely the
call.
Yeah, definitely the mood. So banging books, highly recommend.
Yeah. So glad we read both.
Yeah. Did it leave you with any questions?
Well, the one that I expressed about our blind spots and how we identify them and how we can get away with not seeing them for so long is an unanswerable rhetorical question, because blind spots are almost always identified in hindsight. But that is certainly one. I guess the manifestation of that is, what are the modern blind spots of ours?
Yeah.
I'm a prison abolitionist, so I know the answer to the question, but there are some questions about how we deal with quote-unquote criminals and criminality.
I think that that's a really tough one. And it's tough because, just to quote George Jackson himself, right? He says it right off the bat. He's talking to his lawyer here, and he says, to get at the causes, one would be forced to deal with questions at the very center of American political and economic life, at the core of the American historical experience. This prison didn't come to exist where it does just by happenstance. Mm-hmm. And it's much in the same way, where it's like you can't just destroy the gun and spare the hand. Otherwise, it'll be reforged. Just prison abolition alone doesn't solve the problem. Mm-hmm. We would simply reinvent the prison in another way. We would have neo-slavery by other means. That's such a tough question, because how much of prison abolition as an ideal can be accomplished within the context of not abolishing capitalism as a whole?
I think they're one and the same. And I guess a more bitter form of that question is, how the fuck can an 18-year-old who allegedly stole $70 in 1960 do 10 fucking years, most of it in solitary confinement? That's the question.
Yeah.
Because fuck you.
How did we ever allow this to happen?
Yeah. Did you have any questions?
Did I have any questions? I'd really like more context, honestly, around the whole George Jackson thing.
You mean his death, or?
Well, I just mean around his death and his life. I have a kind of a broad image of where he was at, but I don't know anything about the Black Guerrilla family, right? I hardly know anything about his connection to Angela Davis. This certainly didn't make it any clearer.
Not really.
Yeah. So I'd love some more context for that. It's just not something I got in these 2 weeks, but that's kind of a question on my mind. I think that a lot of the questions I had on our first pass of George Jackson and Blood in My Eye were really answered, right? What happened to all the Black revolutionaries while they were killed?
one by one.
Yep. Either physically or mentally.
A few of them were assimilated, yeah.
Yeah. And George Jackson even mentions that process now. He talks about people like Fred Hampton being murdered. All the radicals get killed, all the rest get converted. And it's like the process just repeats. What was so striking to me is that at the end of the introduction written by George Jackson's nephew, that was in like 94. And he says like, it's still prescient today, and the thing is that it's still prescient today, 30 years later, So it's the same question that George Jackson asks. What is stopping our resistance? And I know that we've asked that question a lot, but it still remains.
Yeah, what's it going to take?
Yeah.
So we fucking loved this book. If you have any thoughts, comments, questions, recommendations for further reading, anything like that, feel free to reach out to us.
leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you.
Please. Absolutely.
This show is funded by listeners like you. Yeah, so what are we reading next, Aaron?
Next time we're going to read The Communist Necessity by J. Mafad Paul.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting. Another maybe very prescient and modern take. Maybe something that's a little more global focused, I think.
Yeah, one day I was sitting around, I had 5 minutes to kill before I had to leave somewhere, and I pulled it off of my bookshelf, and I read the introduction, and I was like, holy shit, we got to read this book. I had already bought it, obviously, but I was like, we got to read this soon. So I've been really stoked to read it. I'm really interested. And what's funny is since I got that book, I've seen his name and some of his other stuff being recommended pretty regularly. So I'm pretty stoked to get into it.
Yeah. So hopefully you'll join us, and don't get left unread.
That's right. Bye-bye.
See ya.